Welcome to IELTS Easy. Listening to, learning to read ahead. This lesson will identify the number one problem encountered in the listening test and teach you the vitally important skill of reading ahead.
Here are goals for this lesson. Take some time to carefully read them, and when you're ready. As a teacher, by far the biggest complaint I receive from students who have completed the listening section of the IELTS test is that they got lost. Everyone seems to start off okay. In fact, most students report that section 1 is really quite easy. But as the test continues, the sections get more and more difficult. Often something is said which a student doesn't quite understand, and before they know it, the section's over and they are still trying to decide the answer to an earlier question. In other words, they get left behind. They get lost. This kind of thing happens all the time. Failure to read ahead leads to panic. Panic leads to errors. And too many errors lead to a low score. Getting lost is the biggest cause of problems in the listening test. So what's the solution? To avoid getting lost? Use what limited time you are given in the test to read ahead. Reading ahead will improve your chances of getting a higher band score in listening. It's so important. But you'd be surprised at how many people sitting for an IELTS exam don't use the time they have available to their best advantage. Instead, they use an unstructured approach and hope that they can somehow keep up. Reading ahead is not simply about perusing the paper. It's about using specific techniques for making the most of your time. The time you have in the exam is very tight and has to be used wisely for maximum success. I'd like to demonstrate how much harder keeping up with a listening test is. When you haven't read ahead, I'm going to play a short listening section similar to what you might hear in an IELTS test. In this demonstration, you won't have the opportunity to read ahead. You'll only see the questions as the audio starts. Unfortunately, this is how many students approach parts of the listening test. See how you go with answering the questions without being able to read ahead. Let's listen to another dialogue. But this time, I'll give you the opportunity to read the questions in advance before you hear the audio. Let's see what a difference it makes. Carefully read the questions when you are ready. Remember, you'll have to answer the questions while you listen to the audio. Because the time available in the IELTS listening test is very limited, you need to have a clear idea of what time you have available to read ahead. As you're aware, there are 4 sections in the listening module exam. At the beginning of each section, you'll be given approximately 30 seconds of silence to preview the questions. You'll also have 30 seconds at the end of each section. But we'll talk about that later. As you are also aware, each of the 4 sections consists of 10 questions each. Usually there's a break in the middle of each of these sections. These moments of silence last approximately 15 seconds. All of the breaks in the audio aren't long, only 15 to 30 seconds. It's how you use the time. However, that's important. I'm sure you found that reading the questions in advance made a difference to your ability to answer the questions correctly. In the exam, you have very limited time to read ahead, so it's important to make every second count. Here in front of you are the techniques which will help you in reading ahead more effectively. Over the years, I've seen students' individual band scores improve as they've diligently applied these techniques. Apply them, and they will work for you. Now, let's take a look at each one of them in some detail. The first technique is to ensure that you read the right amount ahead. Don't read too far in advance, and don't read too little either. In other words, if you're on section 1 of the test, don't read ahead to section 3. You're not going to remember it. What you should do is focus your attention on the current section you are on. And, as you have opportunity, read ahead to the next one. My experience over the years has shown that it is best to use your time to read each question in the section that's coming up. In other words, becoming familiar with the next 10 questions that'll be asked in the next listening section. Remember, it's important that you don't read too far ahead. If you read too far ahead in the test paper, you'll probably forget most of what you've looked at. Years of experience has shown that it's better to really focus on each upcoming section, rather than trying to bombard your brain with too much information. When you read ahead, Read slowly through each question, thinking about what it's saying. As I said, it is far better to read carefully through each question in the current section than it is to just skim many questions in advance. The next technique is the one most often not used, and yet it can make such a difference. As you complete each section in the test, you will hear something like this: "That completes section 1. You now have 30 seconds to check your answers." Many students do exactly as the voice says, and spend the full 30 seconds reviewing their answers. However, I've found that most students do not need the full 30 seconds to review their answers. And this time can be better spent moving ahead with the exam. Instead of using the time to check your answers, immediately move on to the next section and start reading ahead. It is perfectly okay to do this. Using the check answer time to read a section ahead can make all the difference. You then have double the time, in some cases, to think about the upcoming questions. For one of my Korean students who was preparing for the IELTS exam, this technique helped her to gain a couple of extra points, which pushed her listening band score up from 6.0 to 6.5. She began to use part of her 30 seconds at the beginning and end of each section to read ahead. When the next audio section of the test started, she was just that little bit better prepared. This simple activity of using the check answer time to read ahead made a big difference to her score. Students, very importantly, read ahead does not stop when the audio starts. It's important to apply the read ahead technique as you listen. This means not just reading the next question you're about to hear, but reading 2 questions in advance. This is a very important way of ensuring that you don't get lost. Why does it help you from getting lost? Because if you are only looking at the current question, and you miss hearing the answer, you may not realize that the audio has already moved on to the next question. Many students do this, and stay focused on the current question and then suddenly realize that they've been left behind. Reading 2 questions ahead protects you from this problem. I suggest 2 questions in advance, only because any more and you can lose focus. Let's imagine the following questions are asked on your test paper. As soon as the audio begins, not only should you be listening for whom the fitness lessons are suitable, you must also be listening for information about introductory lessons. In other words, you're focused on 2 questions all the time. What happens as soon as you answer question 21? You turn your attention to questions 22 and 23. Once 22 has been answered, you begin to focus part of your attention on question 24. I simply cannot emphasize this enough. You must be reading 2 questions ahead, and avoid at all costs totally focusing on 1 question alone. If you practice this most valuable test technique, I can assure you that you will greatly reduce your chances of getting lost. In summary, students, I can't stress enough how important learning to read ahead is. The information in this lesson alone may be the key to the higher band score you require. You should practice the techniques I have outlined for you until they become part of your standard test-taking procedure. Go over this lesson as many times as you need to, and then practice the techniques until they become part of your test-taking approach. Well done. You have now completed this lesson. Before move on to the next lesson, make sure you fully understand the lesson above. I recommend you to review from the beginning. See you in the next lesson.